So before we get started, no, I did not just get out of bed to do this review. I look like this on purpose. Usually, when I try to review a book, I try to dress in a way that kind of exemplifies what the book is about. And since this is a book about the evils of poverty, well, I figured I'd look like a mess. I'll begin this review by saying this. Have you ever seen a movie or consumed any type of media where you're having a very fun time and then it just all falls apart at the end? That is very much my experience with Crime and Punishment. But before we get to that, let's actually discuss the rest of the story. The main protagonist of this book is a painfully relatable character known as Raskolnikov. Now, Raskolnikov is a college student whose funds are starting to dry up. As such, he decided to quit the university life and find a job. He was able to find a teaching job, but it did not pay him nearly enough to be able to survive. So he quit the job and slowly just went into a bout of awful depression. He was able to get by on paying the rent by pawning off his last great possessions. He goes into a deep depressive state for about 2 months or so, where nobody talks to him, nobody sees him, and he never goes outside. One day, he decides to get some fresh air. So he walks around looking a lot worse than I do now, actually. According to Dostoevsky, or at least Sidney Mona's interpretation of Dostoevsky, he went out in rags that would make even some bums go, "Ugh, couldn't you do any better than that?" He has a few kopecks left. That's basically like cents in American denominations, and it's rubles for the bills. So he decides to have a drink at a local bar. While there, he runs into a retired clerk known as Marmeladov. For some reason, Raskolnikov is drawn to him, which I'm not really sure why. Not only does he talk way too much, but about how he drank his family out of all their wealth that they had. His wife used to be part of the aristocracy. Her father was a major general that had very intense connections and well-to-do people in her family. But she decided to marry a bum, and now they live in the worst type of poverty whatsoever. She tried to help him out of this alcoholic addiction, and he just went right back on the wagon and just sold everything he could to get a reputable job for another bottle of vodka. Why Raskolnikov falls in love with this guy, I don't know, but he's enamored with him. It even follows him home to firsthand see how he just completely destroyed his entire family. And on top of that, it's not just him and his wife, but there's like 3 other kids, as well as an adopted daughter known as Sonia. They're not related by blood in any way, but they kind of took her in. She felt very sorry for Marmeladov and went into prostitution in order to pay to keep the family going. Once again, I don't know why Raskolnikov is so into this character. He just seems like the worst human possible. So that's our main thing about Marmeladov. Now there was another time that Raskolnikov went into a bar and they start talking about the person that he pawned his stuff off to. A miserable old hag that basically gives nothing in return for valuables given to her. The conversation goes about the idea that, if somebody knocked her off, it probably would do the world a pretty good service. Just simply take her money and then give it to the church like she planned to anyway. You'd be doing the world a great favor, as well as destroying a horrible human being. The more Raskolnikov thinks about this, the more he decides to go through with it. He plans down everything to the most minute detail. The weapon of choice is an axe, something that he was able to borrow from his apartment that he's living at. There is a little pocket inside his jacket, which he's able to use to conceal the weapon. I know this is not an axe, but I don't have an axe in my possession, and well, this is just visual for you to understand how it worked. And she goes over to the pawnbroker's house in the guise of having one other thing that he wanted to donate to her. While her back is turned, he lets loose all his fury on the axe and smashes her right on the head. However, he did it with the blunt end and not the blade, so all he really did was just knocked her out. He immediately is able to gather himself, flip it the other way, and then just starts going to town on her. Unfortunately, in his haste, he forgot to lock the door, and her daughter comes in. So, not wanting any witnesses, he then goes to town on her too. From there, he shuts the door, and there are two major witnesses, also people that wanted to pawn off some money to the old hag. They start to notice that the door is open, but yet when they turn around, the door is locked. The precise details are a little muddled, but the main thing you need to know is that Raskolnikov is able to get clean away. However, what he did still kind of haunts him for a while. He spends like the next 3 or 4 days just kind of going in and out of fainting spells, trying to figure out what's reality and what is fantasy. However, during one of these hazes, a summons is brought for him. So this is another thing to mention before I should go further. So Raskolnikov is not alone in the world. He has a mother and a sister. Used to have a father, and very briefly an older brother. The father died of old age, and the brother died of some sort of unknown disease at a very young age. So, his mother writes a letter to Raskolnikov basically telling about what's been going on with them in their lives. So the sister, in order to try to support Raskolnikov to get through college, as well as the family, decides to go to this big house to serve as a governess for a family known as the Savoligovs. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. While I do like the idea they kept the original Russian names, it's kind of intense to have that many consonants next to each other. There's only really a handful of staff, as well as Mr. and Mrs. They had no children. So unfortunately, the Mr. is a horrible, good-for-nothing skirt chaser and just wants every single woman that he can have in his possession. So, Dunia, Raskolnikov's sister, is a very tempting target for him. But she is not having any of it, being like a very righteous and chaste soul. She eventually meets up with him and says, "Look, this has got to stop. What about your wife? What if she ever found out?" But unfortunately, this meeting was kind of overheard by his wife, and she interprets it as, oh, she wants to have an affair with him. It then kicks her out of employment. After a lot of back and forth, the husband comes forward and explains the whole thing. To which the wife just starts singing all her praises in the world. She is absolved for any past crimes, as well as all the bad press that the whole town had got from that. And her job is reinstated, so she's making some money. Now, the mother was able to get a considerable loan to help put Raskolnikov through college. Not a scholarship in any way, she just kind of knew a rich duke, and he was able to get a few $1,000s that way. Unfortunately, during these back and forth episodes of hallucination, the duke sends a summons for Raskolnikov to say that he needs to pay everything in full. Well, this would be perfect, because when he took out the old woman, he also took a lot of major possessions as well, but was not really sure what to do with it. So he goes to the police station, where they bring up the case of the old woman, to which he just starts having these fainting fits. Some people consider him guilty, but obviously there isn't really a whole lot of evidence to go on to here. So probably the main thing to mention was the motive of the murder. So it was very much touched upon that Raskolnikov did it because he thought he was going to be doing society a net good. But on top of that, he was also sick and tired of all these crooked politicians, as well as a lot of other people, just cheating the system and being able to be millionaires in the process. So he thought, if I just whack off this old lady, I'll be able to have enough money to become a great professor, and then I can be great just like them as well. Some time passes, and because of the money that Dunia earned from being a governess, the mother is able to send the money over to help pay for the IOU that was sent to Raskolnikov. During these in-and-out hallucinations, he comes to old friends of his known as Raskolnikov. Kind of an acquaintance they had at college, not necessarily the best of friends, because Raskolnikov is always a loner, but they do have a bit of a friendship. Raskolnikov even tries to get Raskolnikov a job, basically translating textbooks, since both of them are multilingual. However, Raskolnikov doesn't want any pity and just simply goes back to lying in his apartment all day doing nothing. It's during these episodes when the mother and sister come to visit Raskolnikov. Such a shock basically puts him out cold for like another 2 weeks, while Dunia and his mother just can't understand what happened to poor Raskolnikov. But if you've been reading all along, you realize that the city basically corrupted him beyond all recognition. So right before they arrive in town, this horrible person that drunk his family out of all the wealth that they had got ran over by a carriage. Raskolnikov is basically the only one that cares. He is able to get the crowd together and is able to bring what's left of that shattered man into his slummy apartment, where the relatives can finally say goodbye to him. After he perishes, Raskolnikov, having a little extra from his mother's letter, basically pays for the entire funeral. Another big thing to mention as well is that Dunia was actually going to marry a lawyer known as Luhzin. From his mother's letter, he gathers that this guy is just a horrible human being. He's mostly just marrying Dunia so he can have somebody that will save from poverty and know that he can put them right back there whenever he wants to. So during these delirious states, he goes over to see Raskolnikov. And Raskolnikov gives Luhzin a piece of his mind, saying, "You can't do this to my sister. You are an awful person." But being a wealthy lawyer of aristocracy does not take to such tones from a ruffian such as him. So as the mother and sister are in town, the lawyer writes another letter to the sister, basically saying, "Your Raskolnikov is an awful person. Look at what he did to your money. He threw it off onto some prostitute." But Raskolnikov is able to defend himself against these charges. He tells them about the family he was trying to save and everything, and the family believes him. However, Luhzin wants to meet Dunia, as well as Raskolnikov's mother, at their apartment. The whole time, they're ready to fight. In fact, Luhzin said he was going to call off the whole marriage if Raskolnikov ever came to this meeting. They all agree Raskolnikov needs to be there. And by the end of it, even Dunia, who was just really marrying Luhzin for the money, realizes that he is just an awful person and decides to just end the marriage right there. Once again, being an aristocratic lawyer, can't stand this talk from a load of ruffians and says that he will sue them for everything they own. He never really makes good on this promise. So a few days pass, and the funeral that Raskolnikov paid for is all set. Now, obviously the wife, having intense connections, wants only the wealthiest and the most important people to be there. But basically the landlady there hates this woman because she only sees her as a lowly rat, and just invites the biggest bums on the planet to enjoy a nice free meal at their expense. This causes the wife's blood to boil, basically saying, "You ruined my funeral on purpose. My husband deserved far better than this." And plus she's also been dealing with tuberculosis, so she's not necessarily all up there at the same time. Raskolnikov turns out to be the only person at that funeral that has any class whatsoever. However, there is actually a change. So before this party, Luhzin, as well as a roommate of his, once again, it's a really complicated name, I'm not even going to attempt to say it, are basically in their apartment. Luhzin is just kind of counting up all his money from a previous bond that he spent, and also just kind of annoyed at the fact that a low-life ruffian such as Dunia basically said, "Screw you, I don't want your love at all." And plus he had several down payments that required a wife in order to be able to get the deposit back. So there he forms a plan to destroy Raskolnikov's name and make Dunia reconsider the marriage proposal. How they do this is Sonia comes in and they just sit down and talk for a little bit while the roommate is told to stay in the room for this conversation. Luhzin sneaks in 100-ruble note into her pocket without her noticing. At the funeral, Luhzin comes in and accuses Sonia of being a thief. Obviously, the wife just can't stand for this talk, as Sonia is the most religious person on the planet and would never steal a thing. Although that kind of goes against the whole becoming a prostitute in order to give the family money, but anyway. The $100 bill is discovered. Everybody in the crowd basically starts murmuring, "Ooh, this person is no good, she's a thief." But then Raskolnikov comes in to the rescue, basically saying, How dare you? You're just trying to get back at my sister by saying, this person that I'm an acquaintance with is not good, and thus I do not have the authority to such things. In fact, even the roommate steps in and he's just like, how dare you call me a witness? I saw you put that $100 into her dress, and I thought you were just being charitable, but no, you just wanted to pin the whole crime on her. Cousin not having a leg to stand on basically just goes back to saying, I'll sue for this. But everybody in the room is just like, get out of here, you filthy cheat. And so he does. Later on, this Svidrigov character comes to visit Raskolnikov. Not really for any reason other than thinking they might be pretty good friends. However, Raskolnikov sees through this as not having gotten over Dunia. After a rather odd conversation, he leaves. The next day, Raskolnikov comes in to the chief investigator of the case, known as Porfiry Petrovich. Like Marmeladov, this person just goes on and on with dialogue. Sure, it's realistic, but it's just pages of nonsense. Just get to the point already. Raskolnikov comes by to get his pawned-off things back in an effort to clear his name. However, Porfiry is a little suspicious, especially after reading a journal he wrote about how the law does not apply to the great. Porfiry tries to guilt him a little bit with his pages of useless dialogue, and ends by saying he needs him to come back to the station again. The next day, he does, and right as Raskolnikov is about to crack, somebody runs in claiming that they did the murder, and that they couldn't stand the guilt any longer. Raskolnikov is free to go, as this guy's testimony is pretty airtight. However, the guilt slowly starts to eat away at Raskolnikov too, and decides to tell Sonia. At this point, they aren't necessarily a couple, but they have been together a few times. The first major event, Raskolnikov brings into question the existence of God. If he truly loved his people, then how come Sonia, as well as all their family, have to suffer? He even forces her to read a passage from the New Testament, mocking her along the way. Anyways, Raskolnikov confesses to her, and also, and unbeknowingly, Svidrigov, as he was listening in behind the door. It's unclear if he ever told the chief investigator, but it's very heavily hinted at. That night, Svidrigov tells Raskolnikov about him hearing the whole thing, and saying, you need to get air. Plenty of air. All the air you can breathe. Shortly after, Porfiry comes by saying he knows he did it, as new evidence has come to light. Raskolnikov admits nothing, but still wants time to think it over. Porfiry allows this, saying, you need to get air. Plenty of air. All the air you can breathe. However, Svidrigov has other motives. He uses the idea of knowing something important about Dunia's brother to force a meeting. They meet up at his place, which is locked, and everyone has gone home. He tries to force himself upon her, reassuring her there is no escape, and he is so much stronger than she is. However, before coming in, she picked up a gun in case this would happen. He moves toward her and takes a shot, only scraping the side of his head. He then dares her to take another shot. However, Dunia's morals come back to her, and she throws the gun away. Svidrigov then realizes that a pure soul like her could never love a scoundrel like him, and lets her go. With nothing to live for, he ends it with the last round in the revolver. Raskolnikov then decides he's going to turn himself in. The whole time he keeps blaming himself for not following through, as he could have gotten away with it. However, he's given up and gives his testimony. Due to his good acts in the past, he is only sentenced to 8 years of hard labor. He certainly annoyed the court with his testimony, though. They wanted to paint him as simply a common thief who used murder to do so. Instead, it was all about wanting to be something better than he was. In Siberia, Sonia visits Raskolnikov. However, he's not having it, often hating her mere presence. After a while, though, he starts to warm up to her. Until one day, They hold hands, and he immediately becomes a born-again Christian. The book ends with the tease of a sequel for Raskolnikov's redemption arc, and even hints at the idea that he could become a great saint at some point. I hate this ending. It would be like at the end of Moby Dick, Stubb goes to Ahab one last time and says, "Don't chase the white whale," to which Ahab replies, "Okay," and then they live happily ever after. It completely destroys the conflict the story had set up all this time. It feels more like Dostoevsky put this ending in there so the book wouldn't be burned for being antisocial or something like that. In ways, the author is almost like the character, in that he needed to follow through. Sure, Raskolnikov could be a great man, but a saint? This just goes against everything the character stands for, and I feel everybody reading this, and even Dostoevsky, knows this. Yeah, that brings up the final question. Would I recommend it? That's a pretty tall order because I feel like it's really, really good up until the very end, the epilogue. And at that point, it just seems like it completely does a 180 and says, "Oh, and they all lived happily ever after." This is probably what it must have felt like for all the big Game of Thrones fans out there. You go into it knowing that it all kind of falls apart at the end, but it's quite a ride up until then. I highly recommend it. In fact, the crazy thing is I was reading this, I didn't know how fast it was going. Every so often I would just kind of be like, what page am I at? 100, 200, 300? I'm just like, how am I burning through this so quickly? But yet, it doesn't feel like it takes forever. Well, except for when those characters just won't shut up. You got the bum basically giving his entire life story, and Porfiry. These are just characters that just go on, and it's to no end. It's realistic, but to read, it is just awful. But yeah, Crime and Punishment. Good book. Horrible ending. I hope you'll join me next time for my next book review, Madame Bovary. I know this book is a pretty big deal, but I'm not really sure why. I don't really know a whole lot about it. All I know is VeggieTales made a parody of it with Madame Blueberry. And also, I remember one of my friends, he was in AP English, and they had to read this book for school. And how it was described very much by the teacher is that the author of this obviously penned it in French. He would spend days and days on end racking his brain to figure out what the next word should be in his sentence. Then to just kind of have it translated into English just kind of loses that effect a little bit. At the same time, I wouldn't be able to read it in French, just like I wouldn't be able to read Crime and Punishment if it were in Russian. In fact, especially if it was in Russian, I don't even know what the letters are supposed to sound like. Yeah, I hope you'll join me next time for Madame Bovary.